My name is Samuel Green, but everyone knew me as Sam. Today, decades after those hellish days in Bastogne, I still sometimes wake up in the middle of the night in a cold sweat, reliving the moments we spent surrounded by the 5th Panzer Army during the most brutal winter I've ever faced. It was December 1944, and I was just a corporal in the 101st Airborne Division. We had just arrived in Bastogne, Belgium, when all hell broke loose. The Germans had launched a surprise offensive in the Ardennes, and our division was rushed in to hold the line. No one imagined that this mission would turn into one of the most challenging episodes of the war. I remember the first day as if it were yesterday. We were unloading the trucks when the first artillery shells began to fall. Sergeant Miller, a Normandy veteran, shouted for us to take cover. Mike O'Connor, my best friend since basic training, jumped into the same trench as me. "Looks like we're just in time for the party, Sam," he said, trying to smile as the world exploded around us. Our position was on the northern perimeter of the city. We had been ordered to defend that sector at all costs, but no one told us that we would have to do so with limited ammunition, without adequate medical supplies, and, worst of all, without proper winter clothing. Temperatures plummeted to well below zero, and our boots and uniforms were not suitable for those conditions. On the third night, we lost Jimmy Peterson to hypothermia. He was an Arizona boy who had never seen snow in his life. We found his body stiffened during shift change. Mike tried to console me, saying that at least he died in his sleep, but it haunted me for days. We started sleeping in groups, sharing what little body heat we had left. The Germans were attacking daily. Waves of infantry, supported by heavy tanks, tried to break through our lines. We defended every meter tooth and nail, knowing that if Bastogne fell, the entire Allied line could collapse. The division commander, General McAuliffe, replied nuts when the Germans demanded our surrender. At that moment, that single word became our battle cry. Hunger began to torment us as much as the cold. We rationed the few rations we had, but soon we were eating just one meal a day. Some men started chewing pieces of leather from their equipment to cheat their stomachs. Coffee, when we could manage it, was a luxury that kept us minimally warm and alert. One particularly frosty morning, Mike and I were assigned to a reconnaissance patrol. We needed to check out enemy movements in the nearby woods. The snow was knee-deep, and every step was a battle against fatigue and cold. That's when we came across an abandoned German outpost. There were frozen bodies, both theirs and ours, preserved by the cold like macabre statues from a horror museum. "You know, Sam," Mike whispered as we scoured the place for useful supplies, "I think they're just as miserable as we are." We found some tins of German rations, and more importantly, some dry socks. At that moment, those socks were worth more than gold. The days turned into weeks. The siege continued, and our only contact with the outside world was the occasional airdrop of supplies, weather permitting. Often, the packages would fall into the German lines, and we had to watch helplessly as our vital supplies were lost. The worst part wasn't the fighting itself, but the waiting. The endless hours in the freezing trenches, listening to the hiss of artillery shells, never knowing which one had your name written on it. The constant fear of falling asleep and not waking up, frozen in sleep. The pain in his toes, which gradually lost feeling due to the relentless cold. One night, during a particularly intense bombardment, a shell hit close to our position. The impact threw dirt and snow everywhere, and for a moment I was deafened by the explosion. When the dust cleared, I saw that Mike had been hit by shrapnel. He was conscious, but the wound to his leg looked serious. "Don't let me freeze here, Sam," he begged as I tried to stop the bleeding with our practically empty first aid kit. I spent the whole night by his side, talking to keep him awake, sharing stories from home, promising that we would survive to tell that story in some Brooklyn bar. Dawn brought with it another day of resistance, another day of fighting the cold, hunger, and the enemy. But something had changed in me that night. I realized that our real battle was not just against the Germans, but against our own human nature, against the instinct to give up in the face of the impossible. The siege of Bastogne would test every fiber of our being, every ounce of our resolve. And as I watched the sun rise over that frozen battlefield, I still didn't know that the worst days were yet to come. The attacks intensified the following week. Mike had been evacuated to a makeshift medical post in a partially destroyed church in the center of Bastogne. I visited whenever possible, but frontline duties were relentless. Our position was constantly being tested by German probes. One particularly frosty morning, Sergeant Miller gathered our reduced platoon together. "We have information that the Germans are preparing something big," he said, his breath forming clouds in the icy air. "We need to reinforce our positions and maintain constant vigilance." We spent the next few hours digging our trenches deeper and fortifying positions with felled tree trunks. The work was exhausting, but it kept us warm. Frank Martinez, a New Yorker who joined our platoon after the initial casualties, shared with me his last bar of chocolate that he had saved since Christmas. "You know, Green," he said as we shared that little luxury, "before the war I never imagined that I would miss simple things so much. A hot bath, a decent meal, even the annoying noise of the subway." I silently agreed, thinking of my own home in Brooklyn. Our conversation was interrupted by the familiar sound of tank engines. The Germans were using the morning mist as cover. The first Panzer appeared like a ghost through the haze, its menacing silhouette making our hearts race. We only had 2 bazookas for the whole sector, and our anti-tank ammunition was critically low. "Hold your position," shouted Miller. "Let them get closer." The order was easier to give than to carry out. Every meter that war machine advanced seemed like an eternity. My fingers, numb from the cold, nervously squeezed the trigger of my M1 rifle. All hell broke loose when the first tank hit our line of improvised mines. The explosion shook the frozen ground, but the Panzer continued to advance. That's when our artillery came into play. The shells whizzed over our heads, exploding between the armored vehicles and the infantry following them. Martinez and I were operating a .30 machine gun, sweeping through the ranks of German soldiers who were trying to use the tanks as cover. The combat was surreal in that fog. Figures appeared and disappeared like specters, and the deafening sound of explosions mixed with shouts in German and English. A tank shell exploded near our position, throwing frozen earth and shrapnel in all directions. Martinez was hit in the shoulder, but kept feeding the machine gun while I kept up the fire. "I'm not going to let these bastards get through," he muttered between clenched teeth, his blood staining the snow around us. The attack lasted hours, but it felt like days. When we finally repelled the Germans, our sector was unrecognizable. Frozen bodies dotted the battlefield, and a destroyed Panzer was smoking about 50 meters from our position. That night, while we were treating the wounded and reinforcing our defenses, I received news about Mike. The infection had spread, and the doctors were struggling to save him with a few antibiotics available. I sat in my trench, watching the stars through holes in the cloud cover, wondering how many of us would survive this freezing hell. Sergeant Miller passed by handing out the last rations. "Hold your ground, boys," he said. "Reinforcements are on the way." We had heard this before, but this time there was something different in his voice, a certainty that gave us hope. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of airplane engines. They weren't the usual German bombers, but the familiar rumble of American C-47s. Through holes in the clouds, we saw parachutes descending with vital supplies. It was as if the sky itself was sending us a signal that we were not alone. Martinez, still recovering from his injury, smiled for the first time in days. "Did you see that, Green? Not even this damn winter is going to beat us." His determination was contagious, but I knew that our ordeal was far from over. The Germans still surrounded us. The cold was relentless, and every day brought new challenges to our will to survive. As we organized the newly arrived supplies, we couldn't imagine that the next few days would test our endurance in ways that no amount of training could have prepared us for. The battle for Bastogne was far from over, and winter, our cruelest enemy, still had a lot to teach us about the limits of human endurance. The makeshift medical post in the church was a vivid picture of our suffering in Bastogne. I managed to get 2 hours off to visit Mike, and what I found broke my heart. My friend was lying on one of the few mattresses available, his pale skin contrasting with the feverish red of his cheeks. "You look terrible, Sam," he joked, his weak voice barely above the constant sound of distant shelling. I tried to smile, but the sight of the other wounded around us made it difficult to maintain any kind of optimism. The church, once a symbol of peace, was now a repository of pain and hope. The doctor, Captain Roberts, called me into a corner. "The infection is getting worse," he whispered. "We need penicillin, but our stocks have run out. If we don't get more medical supplies soon," he didn't need to finish his sentence. I knew that look well. I'd seen it many times since we arrived in Bastogne. I returned to the front line with renewed determination. Martinez was waiting for me with news. We had intercepted German communications indicating a large medical supply depot about 2 kilometers beyond our lines. Sergeant Miller was organizing a night infiltration mission. "Count me in," he said immediately, thinking of Mike and the other wounded. Miller selected 3 more men. Martinez, Peterson, no relation to Jimmy, who we lost to the cold, and Wilson, an exceptional marksman from Tennessee. We waited until the night was at its darkest. The temperature had dropped even further, and the snow crunched under our boots as we moved silently through no man's land. Wilson led the way, his hunter's eyes searching for enemy patrols. We found the first German sentry post after an hour of careful progression. 2 soldiers, probably as miserable as us, were trying to keep warm next to a small fire. Wilson and Martinez silently neutralized them. This was a different kind of war, where there was no room for hesitation or pity. The depot was guarded by just 1 squadron. The Germans hadn't expected an attack in those conditions. Using the darkness and the terrain to our advantage, we managed to position ourselves strategically. The plan was simple: get in, get the medical supplies, and get out before the alarm was raised. All went well until we found a young German soldier inside the warehouse. He couldn't have been more than 16 years old. Our eyes met for a moment, and I saw in him the same fear and exhaustion that we were carrying. But before anyone could react, Martinez knocked him out with the butt of his rifle. "He's just a kid," muttered Peterson as we rummaged through the shelves. "Like us," I replied, remembering that many of our people were little more than boys when they arrived here. We found several boxes of penicillin and other essential medicines. Each man filled his backpack with as much as he could carry. The return journey would be slower and more dangerous with the extra load, but each vial meant a chance of life for our wounded. The way back was an ordeal. The temperature kept dropping, and our legs ached from the extra effort. Wilson tripped over his snow-covered hole, twisting his ankle. We had to take turns to help him, making our progress even slower. Dawn was beginning to tint the horizon when we finally reached our lines. Captain Roberts almost cried when he saw the supplies. He immediately began distributing the penicillin to the most serious cases. Mike was one of the first to receive the treatment. A few days later, during another German attack, I lost Martinez. A mortar fell near our position, and he threw himself on me, saving my life at the cost of his own. His last words were about his family in the Bronx, and how he hoped they would understand why he had volunteered to fight. Winter was still relentless, but something had changed in our unit after that night mission. We realized that our strength came not just from orders or training, but from the bonds we formed with each other. We were more than soldiers. We were brothers, united by cold, fear, and the determination to survive. Mike began to show signs of improvement, although he was still far from being able to return to the front line. During my visits, I noticed that the other wounded also seemed more hopeful. The medicines we had brought had given many of them a second chance. Sergeant Miller gathered us together one evening to share intercepted news. Patton's Third Army was advancing to come to our aid. The information gave the troops a new lease of life, but it also intensified the German attacks. They knew their time was running out. As I watched the snow fall gently on our position, I thought of everyone we had lost so far. Jimmy, Martinez, and so many others whose names would join the long list of sacrifices of this war. But I also thought of those we had saved, the bonds we had formed, and the strength we had discovered in ourselves. The battle for Bastogne was far from over, but now we had something stronger than cold and fear to keep us fighting. We had each other. The news of the approach of Patton's Third Army brought new cheer to our exhausted troops, but also intensified our agony. The Germans, desperate to break our resistance before the reinforcements arrived, increased the frequency and intensity of their attacks. Mike continued to recover in the church hospital, and I divided my time between visiting him and my duties on the front line. On one of these visits, I found him sitting down for the first time in days. "The doctors say I owe you my life, Sam," he said, his voice stronger. "That penicillin you stole from the Germans worked miracles." Sergeant Miller rallied what was left of our unit for a critical mission. We needed to hold a strategic position known as Hill 176, which dominated one of the main German approach routes. "If we lose that hill," Miller explained, "the Germans will have a direct corridor into the heart of Bastogne." Wilson, still limping from the ankle sprained during our mission to rescue the medical supplies, insisted on taking part. "I'm not going to stay behind while you risk your lives," he said, testing the weight on his injured leg. Peterson and I exchanged worried glances, but we knew we would need every man available. The climb up to the position was torture, the frozen ground was treacherous, and we carried extra ammunition, knowing that every bullet would be crucial. Thompson, a new recruit transferred to our unit after the recent casualties, slipped and twisted his knee. I helped him up, remembering Martinez and his sacrifice. We had barely settled in when the first attack came. The Germans had brought flamethrowers, a terrifying sight against the white backdrop of the snow. The heat from the flares melted the snow instantly, creating a haze that made it even harder to distinguish friend from foe. "Hold your position," Miller shouted over the chaos of the battle. "We can't let them get up this hill." Peterson operated our last .30 machine gun, his methodical cadence keeping the Germans pinned down at the foot of the rise. Wilson, ignoring the pain, hit targets with deadly accuracy from his elevated position. The combat lasted for hours. We lost Peterson when a mortar hit his position. His death hit me like a punch in the gut. He had a pregnant wife waiting for him at home. There was no time to mourn, however. The Germans kept coming, wave after wave. Our ammunition was starting to run low when we heard the sweetest sound possible, the roar of the engines of the American Sherman tanks. The Third Army had finally arrived. The Germans, realizing that they were about to be flanked, began to retreat. The victory had a bitter taste. Of the 12 men who climbed the hill, only 7 survived. Wilson finally succumbed to exhaustion and pain and had to be evacuated. Thompson, the rookie, had proved himself a true soldier, saving 2 wounded comrades under heavy fire. When I returned to the church to tell Mike about our victory, I found him standing on makeshift crutches. "I can't believe I missed all the action," he joked, but I saw in his eyes the same weariness we were all carrying. The battle had aged us decades in a matter of weeks. The siege of Bastogne was officially broken, but our fight was far from over. The Germans still controlled significant parts of the region, and we knew they wouldn't give up easily. More importantly, winter continued its relentless reign, turning every day into a battle for survival. That night, sitting in my trench gazing at the stars through the occasional cloud cover, I thought about everyone we had lost. Peterson, Martinez, Jimmy, and so many others whose names would only become statistics in some official report. But for us, who fought alongside them, who shared their fear, their courage in their last moments, they would forever be heroes. The dawn brought with it the promise of more fighting, more sacrifices, but it also brought something we hadn't seen in Bastogne for weeks: hope. Reinforcements kept arriving, and with them, fresh supplies, ammunition, and, most importantly, new faces to replace those we had lost. The relief brought by the arrival of Patton's Third Army did not mean an immediate end to our suffering. The Germans, even in retreat, were still fighting fiercely, and winter remained our most constant enemy. But something had changed in the air. Perhaps it was hope, perhaps just the knowledge that we were no longer alone. Mike was finally released from the makeshift hospital, although he still had a noticeable limp. "I can't let you have all the fun by yourself," he said when he reported back to the unit. Sergeant Miller assigned him to lighter duties, mainly supply coordination, which was vital considering the constant flow of resources now coming in through the corridor opened up by Patton. Our mission now was to expand the perimeter and push the Germans further and further away from Bastogne. In one of these operations, we found something I'll never forget. It was an isolated farm, apparently abandoned. Thompson, who had become one of our best scouts, signaled that there was movement inside the barn. We approached cautiously, expecting to find an entrenched German unit. Instead, we discovered around 20 Belgian civilians, including several children, who had been hiding there for weeks. They were starving and freezing, surviving on practically nothing. An elderly woman cried when I offered her my ration, saying in broken French that she hadn't seen chocolate for over a year. "This is what we're fighting for," Miller said as we organized the evacuation of civilians. "It's not about territory or politics. It's for these people." That moment changed something in me. Until then, the war had been about survival for me and my comrades. Now, I saw a greater purpose in our suffering. Wilson returned to the unit after recovering, bringing news from command. The Germans were concentrating their forces for a last desperate counterattack. "They know they've lost Bastogne," he explained, "but they want to do as much damage as possible before retreating completely." The prediction proved correct. The next morning, we were awoken by the deafening sound of German artillery. Unlike the previous bombardments, there was an almost suicidal intensity to this attack. The sky seemed to be falling on our heads. "They're using everything they've got," shouted Mike over the noise of the explosions. Our men ran to their positions, now well fortified thanks to the engineering supplies that had arrived with Patton. Thompson was hit by shrapnel early on in the attack, but continued to operate his machine gun, refusing to be evacuated. The battle that followed was one of the most intense I have ever experienced. The Germans attacked with a determination born of desperation. Waves of infantry, supported by their last tanks, tried to break through our lines. The air was so thick with smoke and snow that we could barely see beyond a few meters. "Hold your ground," Miller shouted as he coordinated our defense. "Don't let all our sacrifice be in vain." I thought of everyone we had lost: Martinez, Peterson, Jimmy, and so many others. Their sacrifices would not be forgotten. The battle lasted for hours, but this time we had the advantage. Our artillery responded with devastating precision, and Patton's tanks proved more than a match for the German panzers. When the sun finally broke through the clouds, it illuminated a battlefield where Allied victory was unequivocal. Mike found me after the battle, limping more than usual due to the extra effort. "You know, Sam," he said as we shared a cigarette, "I think we can finally start thinking about going home." I nodded, even though I knew there was still a lot of work ahead. The complete liberation of Bastogne marked not only a military victory, but a transformation in all of us who had survived the siege. The cold, hunger, and constant fear had changed us in ways we would only fully understand years later. Thompson received a medal for his bravery, although he said he would have preferred to have received more ammunition during the siege. Wilson returned to his position as a sniper, now training new recruits in the techniques that had kept us alive during those brutal weeks. Winter was slowly beginning to loosen its grip on Bastogne, but its marks would remain forever in our memories. The city we had defended at such great cost was in ruins, but still standing like all of us who had survived to tell its story. The liberation of Bastogne did not mark the immediate end of the war, but for those of us who survived the siege, it represented a profound transformation. As the last German units withdrew, I began to realize that the man who entered Bastogne was not the same as the one who was leaving. Mike was recovering more every day, although the doctor said he would probably always have a slight limp. "At least I have a good story to tell my future children," he joked, but I could see in his eyes that the memories of the siege haunted him as much as they did me. Our unit was assigned to help rebuild the city. Civilians were beginning to return, and their faces showed a mixture of relief and horror at seeing what was left of their homes. An elderly woman found me helping to clear the rubble from her bakery. She didn't speak English, but her tears and the piece of bread she insisted on giving me spoke more than words. Thompson, still recovering from his wounds from the last attack, was coordinating the distribution of supplies to the civilians. "You know, Green," he told me one day, "before the war I worked in a bank in Chicago. I never imagined I'd end up here, rationing food to people who had lost everything." Sergeant Miller gathered what was left of our unit for one last mission: to locate and identify the bodies of our fallen comrades so that they could receive a proper burial. It was a grim but necessary task. Each dog tag we found represented not just a soldier, but a family waiting for news back home. Martinez was right, Wilson commented as we marked another spot. We're all miserable here, Americans and Germans. We found so many young men frozen in the positions where they had fallen, some still clutching their weapons, others with letters from home in their pockets. Spring was beginning to show its first signs, melting the snow that had been our companion and enemy for so long. With the thaw, other macabre discoveries emerged. Each body found reminded me of Jimmy, our first fallen, and how his death from hypothermia had only been the beginning of our ordeal. Mike was finally ordered to return to the United States. His leg would never fully recover for combat duty. The night before his departure, we shared our last meal in Bastogne. "Promise you'll visit me when this is all over, Sam," he said. "There's a bar in Brooklyn that needs to hear our story." The command began to redeploy the units for the final offensive against Germany. Our little group, which had become a family forged in the ice and fire of Bastogne, would be separated. Thompson would go to the Pacific, Wilson to Berlin, and I would soon receive new orders. On our last night together, we sat around a makeshift campfire. Sergeant Miller, always reserved, finally shared his thoughts. "You're the best men I've ever commanded. What we did here in Bastogne, what we endured, no one who hasn't been here will ever fully understand." He was right. How do you explain to someone the sound of the biting wind in the trenches at night? The smell of frozen death? The feeling of hunger so deep that it makes your organs ache? Or, paradoxically, the moments of humanity we find in the midst of chaos? The chocolate shared, the stories whispered to keep a friend awake, the silent sacrifice of men like Martinez? Before leaving, I visited the church one last time. The makeshift medical post had been dismantled, but the marks of our struggle remained on the walls. I sat on a bench and thought about everyone we had lost and saved in that place. The war would continue for a few months yet, but for me, Bastogne would always be the place where I learned the true meaning of sacrifice and brotherhood. Decades have passed since those hellish days, but the memories remain vivid. Mike and I kept our promise to meet in that bar in Brooklyn and share a story. Thompson died in the Pacific, never having the chance to return to his bank in Chicago. Wilson survived the war and became a teacher, teaching new generations about the real cost of conflict. As for me, I carry Bastogne with me every step of the way. In the cold of winter, I still feel the ghost of that ice that almost defeated us. But I also carry the warmth of friendships forged in the most adverse circumstances, the pride of having been part of something bigger than ourselves, and the certainty that true human strength is revealed not only in our ability to fight, but in our determination to survive and protect each other. The snow in Bastogne has finally melted, but the lessons we learned there remain frozen in time, an eternal testament to the resilience of the human spirit in the face of the impossible.